Ruth McCambridge joins us today to share some information about the Nonprofit Quarterly and an article she wrote in it called Underestimating the Power of Nonprofit Governance. Ruth, can you tell us about the mission of the Nonprofit Quarterly and the audience that it is aimed at?
Well, Nonprofit Quarterly's audience is, we've got a variety of communities that are among our audience, and really primary among them are people who are working in and around nonprofits and in civil society. But the mission of our journal is very different from most other journals in that our mission is to promote active democracy. We see nonprofits as a venue for people taking action on issues that they're concerned about, that affect them. And so the nonprofits and the management, the governance of nonprofits is then our business, because the way nonprofits are governed have everything to do with the levels of engagement around them. So it is different from an academic journal, but we've really got one foot in academia and one foot in practice. And so what we try to do is to move questions and answers back and forth between those two realms so that as questions appear in practice or in academia, that we can test them in both areas and see if there are ways to get to answers so that we can move the learning along more quickly.
Why did the Nonprofit Quarterly decide to publish a special issue on nonprofit governance?
We decided to do a special issue because I think governance is one of the areas in which nonprofits have the most confused practice. In general, we feel like they don't quite understand the capabilities of governance, that they don't understand what it can be used for. And there is an enormous amount that has to be unlearned before people can even begin to learn what the potential of governance really is. And so what we decided to do was to put together a collection of articles which really reflected the latest in research on the issue, and use it as a platform actually for surfacing additional questions. And so you'll find some really classic articles in there, like an article about reframing governance, which is it's been the jumping off point for a lot of other inquiries on the issue of network governance. So what we see the collection as being is really a kind of a small reader on the basic questions that we're working on right now.
Ruth, why did you make the special governance issue accessible to students?
Well, Nonprofit Quarterly is mission-driven. We're a nonprofit ourselves, and our major intention is not to make money off of what we produce, but it is to help people learn about the practice of running these very important democratic institutions. And for us, it's just a thrill to be able to share this with the students in this course. It's a thrill. And I would encourage people, as you continue along in your practice, if you feel like in your reflection of your own practice you've learned something, that you want to question something, feel free to submit an article to us, because that's how the dialogue continues.
Ruth, you wrote an article in the special governance issue on underestimating the power of nonprofit governance. What is this article about, and why is it important?
The article is about governance as it exists in a nonprofit's universe, less about boards, much more about relationships with stakeholders that nonprofits have and it can work with if they are so inclined. In my opinion, the reason why I wrote this article was because I had been a part of a number of events in Northern Ireland and elsewhere where we really took some very significant critical questions to a group of 90 people or more. and tried to work with them to get to a place where we understood what was the future that was being longed for collectively and what they wanted to do about it. In general, I feel like that is the basic core job of governance, is to do that with one's stakeholders often enough and in a way that's open enough that the longings of the stakeholders, the beneficiaries of the organization, are actually reflected in the work that the organization does in a way that can really be seen and experienced. When I say that we underestimate the power of nonprofit governance, the way most boards function is so insular at this point, and so limited in terms of its ability to really gauge what it is stakeholders want from an organization, especially as it moves into the future, that we're just wasting an enormous resource. Because when you do work with the larger scheme of governance, it brings you all kinds of other riches, because then you've got people's energy, you've got people's intelligence, you've got people's, whatever capital they may have to share with you. They're ambassadors for you, so that it's just so wasteful for a nonprofit to really think small. That all there is to governance is the board. In fact, governance exists all around an organization, and if you ignore it, it may bring you up extremely short, because they may call you on your lack of responsiveness. And that's happening more and more often, as we know, because the digital environment is making it very easy for stakeholders to call any kind of institution, but particularly a nonprofit, up short if it does not reflect the value set of the stakeholders.
Can you give some examples of how a board might engage its stakeholders and community?
Yeah, I recently worked with an organization in Jackson, Tennessee, and it's a small city. It's a older organization, probably 50 years old or so, and a multi-service organization. And it had started off as being a anti-poverty agency, and over the years it had very, very good leadership, and then it hired a real charismatic nutcase. And the charismatic nutcase went very systematically about ruining all of the relationships that the organization had. So they lost a number of funding relationships, other things happened, and they fell really out of connection with a good part of the community. When I talked to the woman who was the new executive director after that man had left, what we talked about was her really calling up everybody in the community that she could think of that might possibly be a decent board member. Not to ask them on the board, but to ask them if they would participate in some committee or another that would take up one critical question of this organization that had to do like this massive rebuilding. And in the process of doing that, they engaged, they had each board member take a committee, and they involved staff, and then they would involve community members in these committees. In doing that, what they found was that they actually identified all of these people who were interested in the organization. Most people said yes to her. They just needed to be asked. And then they were able, through the committee work, to help them understand what the critical variables were for the organization at that point. As a result of all of that, they've engaged this kind of massive base of people around the organization that can be called on, but they've also been able to observe people in such a way in that committee work that they've been able to choose the best of them to move onto the board, and they've already experienced this larger engagement system, so they know how important it is, and that was kind of the way in to develop this larger system. There are, I think, a number of ways to do this, but that's at least one that was entirely within the reach of a small community organization. So this doesn't need a super sophisticated system. It needs thought about what kind of community do I exist in, what are the questions they might have, how do I engage them in good faith in answering our combined questions together. And that kind of invitation automatically creates a link, and then you build on it from there.
Finally, your article is going to be the subject of a peer learning discussion this week. Can you suggest some questions to help frame our discussion?
I think the questions that people should consider is, do you know who your stakeholder groups are, and particularly who your primary beneficiaries are? John Carver used to talk about that your primary fidelity should be to those in whose name you do business. So who it is that you take money to serve or to represent should be your primary beneficiaries. Do you know who they are? Do you know how to balance the demands of that group against the demands of others, say funders? These are some of the most difficult questions that a lot of nonprofits and NGOs face. How do we fairly represent the needs and the interests of our beneficiaries when we spend so much time elsewhere? Do you have ways of inquiring what your beneficiaries' needs are? Are those ways kind of are they closed questions or open questions? That's a very important distinction. If you're surveying or doing a needs assessment, that is very different than convening people and asking people, what are your greatest longings about what we do? So those are the questions, really. Who are our stakeholders? How should we be consulting them? Who do we need to listen to most acutely? And how do we develop our future plan from all of that? Those are the questions that you have to ask yourself.
Thank you, Ruth, for sharing your journal, your knowledge, and these questions, which we look forward to discussing this week.